I'm interested in what kinds of things do neuroscientists do when they say they're explaining something? And what are the limits of those kinds of explanations? And the very basis of the account that I've given is that they're into understanding mechanisms in the way that much of biology is interested in understanding mechanisms. So they say, give me some complex phenomenon that I want to understand. Neurons generate action potentials. Voltage changes across the membrane of the neuron that are the basic signal of nerve conduction in the brain. They want to say, how are action potentials generated? And the way that they start to give the answer to that question is they talk about the parts of neurons and how those parts interact with one another. They talk about the ions in the fluids around the cell and how they flux in and out of the cell. And they paint a picture about how one thing causes the next, causes the next, causes the next, causes the next, causes the voltage to change in the membrane. And that's a mechanistic explanation, is a story about a bunch of parts and their causal organization and how they work together to do something like that. And so I think that you asked me the hardest question that faces somebody who does philosophy of neuroscience, and I think the hardest question is whether something that has that kind of structure, something that's merely a bunch of parts causally organized together, could be the kind of thing that could have thoughts about stuff, could be the kind of thing that could make decisions, and could be the kind of thing that has an interior mental life, a kind of consciousness. Or alternatively, is the thought that the explanation for these phenomena, conscious choice, reasoning, conscious experience, are we making a false assumption about the kinds of explanations that those kinds of things should be given? Will they ultimately be explained like action potentials? Or should, perhaps for how do we understand things, maybe that's more of a social story about the kinds of things that we say in response to questions, the kinds of way that we answer questions, the kind of way that the kinds of things that we can and cannot do.
I was under the impression that there is a consensus that subjective experience is a sort of illusory personal consciousness from the scientific point of view, that it really is biochemical, and our sense of self is a little bit of an illusion, and that it's supposed that there's emergence through complexity, and that there are systems we don't yet understand why biochemistry should lead to that result, but that maybe eventually we will, or that there are systems to be further understood.
So you don't think
that
you think that it's a consensus
I thought there was.
that you don't exist, or that that your sense of who you are is fundamental?
I thought so.
The neuroscientists have suggested that you're just.
I thought so. I thought, yes.
That would be shocking, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't know. I thought that if you ask a scientist, he'd say, well, it's not that you don't have personal autonomy, but it's based on these, you really wouldn't want to jump in the swimming pool if it weren't this hot. Or, you think you're making a choice, but all your environmental stimuli are causing almost an inevitable sort of, I know that's very deterministic, but I did think that's the way in which most scientists would.
Yeah, like I said, most scientists will. I think most scientists have sort of the kind of thoughts that you would have in your freshman dorm about this kind of stuff. What is it to be free will? It's to be free of the causal order. We make the assumption that everything going on in the brain is just causal commerce. Therefore, there's no room in there for free choice. So we don't have free choice, and that's why there are all these articles that are showing up recently about my brain made me do it, and people trying to get off for various crimes they've committed because their brains made them act in the way that they do. Yeah, and I think that the neuroscientists generally just embrace this kind of hard determinist. Many neuroscientists, I think, embrace a kind of hard determinism. But then you ask, what evidence? Is that based on evidence, or is that just your convictions as a scientist that everything in this world has a certain kind of causal explanation? And on what do you do with the cases of probabilistic explanation in certain areas of science, irreducibly probabilistic explanations in certain areas of science, or with the possibility that there might be ways of understanding that are not causal in nature? Well, I don't think that what you and I are doing when we understand one another right now involves you understanding the causal structure of my brain. I say things, you understand them, you interpret what I'm saying in light of what I probably also believe in the background. There are a bunch of assumptions that are underlying this discussion that you bring to the table. You render me intelligible, not by understanding my internal causal order, but by trying to make what I say maximally coherent. And that's a kind of standard of intelligibility that we might bring to our everyday interactions with one another that doesn't involve a kind of causal intelligibility, understanding the internal structure of it and how the causes all work together to produce this phenomenon. So it might be that what we really need if we want to unlock the human mind from a scientific perspective is a combination of that sort of causal understanding that neuroscientists are so good at giving, and figuring out how that fits together with these other modes of understanding that we typically are engaged in. And it might be that our everyday understanding of the mind is parasitic on a different form of intelligibility than causal intelligibility. But if you're somebody who hasn't thought much about forms of, if you want to explain something in mathematics, it's not going to be, why is the Pythagorean theorem true? That's not going to be a causal story about triangles. That's going to be a conceptual story about triangles, and it requires a different kind of explanation than we would give in biology for something. So part of, I guess part of this brings us back to the role of the philosopher. Part of the role of the philosopher is to just be mindful of the fact that we often make these starting assumptions. Of course, it's all a causal machine in here, and if that's true, well, then it's going to follow that we don't have choice and we aren't responsible, or at least so many people argue. But is that the right way for us to approach these questions? Is that the only mode of intelligibility? Are those assumptions warranted, or are they just articles of faith for 21st century scientists?
Why is it important to ask that question? If we never ask that question, what do we get that's bad?
Well, if the goal is truth, if we want to understand our place in the world, and not just pretend to understand our place in the world, or tell ourselves a satisfying story about our place in the world, but really get at how it's possible that something like us could exist in a world that's made only of atoms combined in the ways that they do, interacting in the ways that they do. Cheap answers shouldn't be allowed, and they should be intellectually rigorous all the way down. If something in neuroscience conflicts with something in physics, you could say, like, well, let's just keep the neuroscience going. It doesn't matter if, for this thing to work this way, it would have to violate fundamental laws of physics. You wouldn't just say, like, oh, well, so much the worse. Why not just keep the neuroscience the way it is? You'd say, no, we want all of these pictures to at least be compatible with one another.